For the first 3 years of World War I, the United States stood apart. President Woodrow Wilson proclaimed neutrality, and most Americans were content to watch the storm rage across the Atlantic from a safe distance. After all, the war seemed to be Europe's problem, an entangled conflict rooted in centuries of rivalries and alliances. The prevailing sentiment was that America should remain the great neutral, trading with all sides while avoiding the horrors of the trenches. But neutrality became harder to maintain. The sinking of the Lusitania in 1915 had already stirred outrage, and Germany's policy of unrestricted submarine warfare, attacking any ship bound for Britain, continued to provoke American anger. Still, Wilson resisted calls for war, famously winning re-election in 1916 with the slogan, "He kept us out of war." Everything changed in early 1917. Germany announced it would resume unrestricted submarine warfare, knowing it might bring the U.S. into the conflict, but gambling that Britain could be starved into submission first. At the same time, British intelligence intercepted the infamous Zimmermann telegram, a secret message from Germany to Mexico, promising U.S. territory in exchange for joining the war against America. When the telegram was revealed, Americans were shocked and enraged. Suddenly, the war was no longer just Europe's quarrel. It was a direct threat to the United States. On April 2, 1917, President Wilson went before Congress to ask for a declaration of war. His words captured the moral purpose he saw in America's entry. The world must be made safe for democracy. 4 days later, Congress voted overwhelmingly to declare war on Germany. The United States, once an observer, was now a participant in the greatest conflict the world had ever seen. The entry of the United States transformed the war. At first, America's army was small and untested, but the promise of fresh manpower, industrial strength, and financial resources gave the Allies new hope. By 1918, more than 2 million U.S. soldiers, the American Expeditionary Force under General John J. Pershing, had arrived in France. Known as the Doughboys, these young men brought fresh energy to a battlefield exhausted by years of attrition. For the American people, the war became both a challenge and a cause. Thousands volunteered, while millions more were drafted. Women took on new roles in factories and offices, fueling the war effort at home. Propaganda posters urged citizens to buy Liberty bonds, conserve food, and support the troops. Songs like "Over There" became rallying cries. For many Americans, World War I was their first true experience of being part of a global struggle. On the battlefield, U.S. forces quickly proved their worth. They fought with determination in major offensives such as Cantigny, Belleau Wood, Saint-Mihiel, and the Meuse-Argonne, where they helped break German lines and push the war toward its conclusion. At Belleau Wood in 1918, U.S. Marines earned lasting fame, fighting with such ferocity that the Germans nicknamed them "devil dogs." But the cost was heavy. Over 116,000 Americans were killed and more than 200,000 wounded in just over a year of fighting. For families across the United States, the war's impact was deeply personal. The graves of American soldiers still dot the fields of France, silent witnesses to the nation's sacrifice. For a U.S. audience, the entry into World War I is particularly heart-touching because it marked the moment America stepped onto the global stage, not just as an economic power, but as a defender of ideals. Wilson framed it as a fight for democracy, justice, and peace, a vision that resonated deeply, even if the aftermath of the war proved more complicated. In hindsight, April 1917 was a turning point, not only in the war, but in American history. It was the beginning of the United States' role as a world leader, a responsibility that would continue through World War II and into the modern era. For ordinary Americans then and now, it was also a reminder that the ocean could no longer shield them from global conflict. The U.S. entry into World War I stands as a story of reluctant involvement transformed into decisive action, with consequences that shaped the century to come.